Happy Sunday, everybody. Just how many different branches or sects or denominations of Mormonism are there? This is a question we're going to unpack today because what I've found is a lot of people don't realize how many breakoffs there have been in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, a lot of this, not all of it, as we'll get into, but a lot of it stems from the succession crisis. Church members were divided over who would be Joseph Smith's successor, despite regularly being kidnapped and thrown in jail and all these injustices that were perpetuated upon Joseph Smith. Despite all of that, he did not establish any firm policies for who should succeed him in the event of his death. There were actually some different things that he said at different times, so that had created some confusion. The primary contention, of course, was between Sidney Rigdon, who was a counselor in the first presidency and felt that the role and responsibility should fall to him. And then the other one was, of course, Brigham Young, president of the Quorum of the 12. I talked about this a bit in a past musing that I will link to in the YouTube description about the Brother Brigham's Transfiguration Tall Tale, this mythical claim that, you know, the mantle of Joseph fell upon Brigham and he sounded like him, even the lisp after Joseph, you know, had a tooth broken, and these, you know, claims that simply there's no historical evidence or contemporary records or anything to substantiate. It's like this claim after the fact to bolster Brigham's position and show that, you know, Joseph was on Brigham's side. So I'll link to that in the YouTube description where we'll get more into the succession crisis. I'm also fairly intrigued to see later this fall how things are going to be portrayed in a new film coming out for an LDS audience called 6 Days in August about the succession crisis. Let's watch the trailer really quick so you can see what this might look like.
Joe Smith thinks he's above the law.
It's our duty to see that the law is obeyed.
By whatever means we find necessary.
Brigham, what is it?
Joseph and Hiram are dead.
What will we do?
Joseph never discussed who should lead the saints. Men seek for power. The church needs a leader. I'm afraid of who it might be.
Joseph is gone. Hiram gone. As the last surviving member of the first presidency, it falls on me.
Sidney, I don't care who leads the church, but it won't be you unless God speaks it.
What about my family?
Emma, nothing has changed.
Everything has changed.
I want to weep for a month. I submit him. I'm not sure what happens next.
There is unrest. You assume that because Joseph is gone, our enemies will leave us alone.
They are too powerful.
The Mormons have called this a war.
We will not be driven from our homes again. We will preach or fight, whichever is required. You will not fail.
Do you see them on top of the temple?
For Israel!
There's talk of 4 or 5 different successors. And so you plot.
He conferred upon our heads all the keys before he was taken away. This child will manage the flock for a season.
We have all done the best we could without Joseph. We will now have to walk by faith, not by sight.
Okay, so obviously these are a bunch of so-called Brighamites, people in the mainstream church who are writing this perspective. No doubt it's going to confine itself entirely to Brigham's claims and perspectives. So the purpose of this music is not necessarily to dig into the succession crisis itself and the competing claims, more just to highlight the number of breakoffs there have been, share a little bit of information about them, to better understand how things have developed and led us to where we are today. Now, one of the more interesting, although incomplete, graphics that I have seen illustrating this can be found here on the Wikipedia. Here's this graphic, the main black line showing the mainstream church and the Brighamite church, and then all of these different breakoffs that have arisen over time. Now, what's fascinating about this is, there's a lot of data here. What's fascinating about this is that it does not include, apparently, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the polygamous branches, which is extremely odd because the rest of this chart is very detailed and it's got a really tiny little branch that's split off, but not this major one. So potentially there are other branches not included in this image, but I thought it was kind of a fascinating insight into some of the different branches that there have been. Let's begin with Sidney Rigdon. So like the Quorum of the 12, Sidney had been ordained as a prophet, seer, and revelator. And so after he kind of lost in the succession crisis, and the majority, certainly not all, but the majority of saints sided with Brigham, Sidney Rigdon and his followers ended up moving to Pennsylvania. And he started, not even started, right? The idea was that I am continuing the true church. And so his church was called the Church of Jesus Christ, and but it disbanded after a few years. And one of his converts in the meantime was a gentleman by the name of William Bickerton. And Bickerton continued preaching even after the dissolution of the Rigdon Church. And in May of 1851, organized a branch in Pennsylvania, grew their numbers. A decade later, there were enough of them that they chose 12 apostles. They incorporated in Pittsburgh in June of 1865 with the legal name Church of Jesus Christ of Green Oak, Pennsylvania. And later they simply amended it to be the Church of Jesus Christ. They're nicknamed either the Rigdonites, because that's kind of where this branch came off, or the Bickertonites, after William Bickerton, who kind of kick-started or restarted the Rigdon church, and those who felt that the true presiding power of the priesthood and the keys came through Sidney Rigdon. And at present, they've got somewhere around 23,000 members. So this is a branch that still continues in its existence. And, they share this foundational belief, Joseph Smith, the Restoration, Book of Mormon, etc. But they believe that, Brigham did not have the authority that Sidney Rigdon did, and then that came down through William Bickerton, and that's where the true church and the path of it has gone. So that is the result of Sidney Rigdon. Now, it wasn't just Sidney and Brigham duking it out. There was also a claim of authority and leadership made by one James Strang, who at the time was a relatively recent convert to the church. He presented a letter that he purported to be from Joseph Smith, designated him, James Strang, as a successor, and also claimed that Strang also claimed that at the moment of Joseph's death, he was visited by angels who ordained him to be Joseph Smith's successor. He not only had this claim in this purported letter, but there was this discovery of the Vori plates that purported to contain the last testament of an ancient Native American named Raja Manchu of Vorito. And so there were these plates, and to a lot of members of the church who were enticed by the claims of James Strang, it was following the pattern of Joseph. It's, we knew that out of the ground, more voices would come through these plates and records. And so here God is telling us that it's this, James Strang guy. And so there was these Vori plates that had some depictions on them, and the plates disappeared around the year 1900, and their current whereabouts is unknown. And these claims, the letter, the claim of angelic visitations, these purported plates that claim to talk about the last testament of Raja Manchu of Vorito, these things were enough to persuade, as I said, a lot of people, including prominent people. So William Smith, Joseph Smith's brother, more on him in just a minute, in fact. Martin Harris, William Marks, who was the stake president in Nauvoo, Joseph's own mother, Lucy, Lucy Mack Smith, as well as some other Smiths like William and some others. One of the apostles, John Page, believed in the claims of James Strang. John C. Bennett, the notorious Bennett, believed that Strang's claims were accurate. In fact, Bennett went so far, perhaps unsurprisingly, to form a secretive Strangite fraternal society known as, and I kid you not, the Order of Illuminati. Wow. So Bennett was soon excommunicated again from the Strangite group. Now, all of these folks, despite this kind of early interest in James Strang, all of them left by 1850. And most of them left over the issue of polygamy. You see, James Strang had been very opposed to the practice at first, and a lot of the people who decided to follow him, Joseph's mother, right, and William Marks and so forth, they believed that Joseph was innocent of the claims that he was behind spiritual whiffery and doing all this in secret. And so James Strang was on their side. He was saying, no, polygamy is wrong. Well, he made an about-face. He reversed course in 1849 to become one of polygamy's strongest advocates, and so then he lost a bunch of these people who felt like this guy is not from God because he's falling into this trap, just like Brigham and others were. And so he ended up, he maintained a group of people. They relocated to Michigan. At its peak, they had around 12,000 members in the Strangite branch of the church. Strang for himself was actually murdered in 1856 by a couple of his followers, after which most of the followers went and joined the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which we'll talk about in a bit. And today there's around 130 active members of the Strangite branch, so very, very small. They're kind of split into two little groups from differing perspectives. So that's the legacy of the branch of James Strang. There's also the Whiteites, but you've never heard of the Whiteites, the Whiteite branch. So Lyman White was an apostle, 1841, and during the succession crisis, he felt compelled to follow directives that Joseph had previously given him to develop a community, a safe haven for Latter-day Saints in the Republic of Texas. Joseph had previously given him these instructions. He's an apostle. He feels like he needs to follow that charge and continue to do that. Brigham, fellow apostle, tries to get Lyman White to stop, to join Brigham's group and eventually go west. White consistently refused. He actually rejected Brigham as the prophet, as the president of the church, prompting Brigham to, unsurprisingly, excommunicate him December 3rd of 1848. So White's followers, interestingly, they built the first temple west of the Mississippi. This was in Zodiac, Texas. They did sealings, ordinations, washings and anointings, adoptions. There's a large 2-story log building that was kind of a multi-purpose center for the area. It was a company storehouse, and then they had this room upstairs for temple ritual. The building no longer stands, but it was the first temple from a branch of Mormonism, from this apostle who was excommunicated from the kind of mainline Brighamite church. After his death in 1858, his followers scattered. Some of them joined the LDS Brighamite branch. Some of them joined the RLDS, the reorganized branch. And that was the impact, short-lived for Lyman White, the Whiteites, the Whiteite branch. I mentioned earlier William Smith, Joseph's brother, is someone who followed James Strang. He was the 8th child of Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy, so he's the younger brother of Joseph. He was ordained an apostle in 1835, so a decade prior to Joseph's assassination. So William Smith, he's an apostle. He was even elected to the Illinois legislature. And after Hiram died, his older brother Hiram, William succeeded him as patriarch, the presiding patriarch of the church. However, shortly after that, Brigham stated that William was a patriarch to the church and not over the church. So this minor difference, but it was enough to widen the growing chasm between, Joseph's family, including Emma and Lucy and others who rejected Brigham and felt that he was, being abusive and that he was behind polygamy and everything else. And so this chasm opens between William and Brigham as well. William himself feels that it's a slight to say that he is not patriarch over the church, the presiding patriarch, but he is trying to reduce his stature and his influence, of course, in the church. And in the October 1845 General Conference, Parley Pratt gets up and objects to William Smith being ordained as, or rather retained as an apostle and a patriarch. So Parley Pratt objects to this, and those in attendance at the conference sided with Pratt, and so William Smith was disfellowshipped. He writes a newspaper article comparing Brigham to Pontius Pilate and to Nero, the Roman emperor, accused him, Brigham, and others of the 12 of secretly keeping multiple spiritual wives. As a result, he's excommunicated by Brigham on grounds of apostasy, just like a couple weeks after General Conference, after he was kicked out or disfellowshipped. Ended up joining with the Strangites, as I said earlier. Then 1847 comes around, and William Smith says he's president of the church and that he held a right to its leadership due to the doctrine of lineal succession, basically coming through the family of Joseph. So he, William Smith, excommunicates Brigham in the Quorum of the 12, and he says, hey, no, I have a right to preside over the church. Lyman White of Whiteite fame that I just mentioned, one of the apostles, recognized William Smith's leadership, agreed with the lineal succession claim, and joined up and started following William Smith. However, the church was dissolved within just a few years, and so in 1870, fast forwarding a bit, he ends up joining the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which was at that time being run by his nephew, Joseph Smith III, and most of his followers, William Smith's followers, also join up. So they still following the doctrine of lineal succession, because now it's Joseph's son directly rather than a brother. So let's dig into the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So the formal reorganization occurred April 6th, of course, special day for founding of the church 3 decades prior. This one in 1860 in Illinois. And so it was titled the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They added the word reorganized 12 years later in 1872. And prior to the founding of it, so from 1844 to, which is when Joseph died and the succession crisis happened, from then until 1860, when the reorganized church was reorganized, they consider it to be a period of disorganization. There were basically just a bunch of independent Mormons, tiny little branches that, felt adrift, you might say. They didn't know who leadership was going to be. Joseph Smith III is very young. At first, he rejects, taking up the mantle, and so they start forming the church without him, and then he comes forward. He's like, yeah, okay, I've been told that I need to step in and do this. So for a century, you've got the reorganized church that sides with Joseph's family against Brigham. Brigham, of course, deeply critical of Emma and the Smith family, claiming that they've gone down the road to apostasy because they won't accept the doctrine of the plurality of wives. And so a century later, there's a new revelation, this one from Wallace Smith, who at this point is president of the church, in which he announces both the construction of the Independence Temple — you've probably seen that kind of spiral-looking temple, and as well the ordination of women as well. So this is in mid-'80s when he says, hey, we're going to ordain women to the priesthood, after many in the community had been calling for both the temple and women in leadership. So Wallace himself is the great-grandson of Joseph, so they're continuing this doctrine of lineal succession. So that creates a chasm. We'll talk about that, some of the breakoffs from RLDS in just a moment. But there's a lot of people who disagree. There's a lot of people who think now the church has gone into apostasy. You've gone off the rails. That's unacceptable. So that prompts a bunch of people to leave. Well, Wallace gets old, and he decides upon retirement to appoint someone else to be the new president of the church. His name is Grant McMurray. And although he had been appointed by Wallace Smith, Joseph Smith's great-grandson, there were a lot of people who objected to the appointment of Grant McMurray because he was the first church president who was not a direct descendant of Joseph Smith, and which they considered to be, a point of distinction from other branches of Mormonism, that, hey, we have lineal succession and, Joseph has the right to rule and his posterity. And so, the women in the priesthood and the breaking the lineal succession, these were very controversial, and some tens of thousands of people leave the reorganized church and, form breakaway churches, again, go back to this kind of independent status. And so it was this big schism, this big problem for the reorganized church. So between the mid-1960s and the late 1990s, about 3 decades, there was about a 1/3 decline in new baptisms for the reorganized church and a 50% drop in contributions. So these key doctrinal and procedural type changes that they're making has just kind of gutted the church. Now, of course, they're called the Community of Christ. And as I talked about in the past musing, when they decided to sell some of these really important properties to the Brighamite branch of the church, including the Kirtland Temple, a lot of this was precipitated by the fact that their finances are very poor because they've consistently lost tithe payers and aren't really recruiting a lot of young people to bolster their tithing funds. And so they were in a dire financial position and felt pushed into selling. Okay, let's next go to the Hedrigites. So this is the Church of Christ Temple Lot, as they are sometimes called. So after the Saints went west, as I said, there were a bunch of unaffiliated branches just kind of lingering around different communities, mostly around Illinois. Of course, that's where Nauvoo is. And so many of these branches united under the leadership of Granville Hedrick. This was in May of 1863. And so in July, just a couple months later, Hedrick was ordained as prophet, president, seer, and revelator. And who participates in his ordination? John Page, the apostle, who had previously been an apostle, under Joseph, who had supported Strang for a little while, and now he's supporting Granville Hedrick. This guy's bouncing around a little bit. They changed their name back to the Church of Christ, like Joseph Smith originally had it. And the Temple Lot, in parentheses, is not in the legal name. It's just to distinguish them from other branches of the Mormon church that also call themselves the Church of Christ. So why are they called Church of Christ Temple Lot? Well, it's because they own the Temple Lot. It's a 2-acre plot that was designated by Joseph Smith for the Temple of the New Jerusalem in the future. So this is the church that owns it. The Hedrickites, in fact, returned to independence in 1867 and to purchase the lot, and they've been headquartered there ever since. In fact, the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints sued the Temple Lot Church in 1891, trying to get the title, claiming that it was theirs, and they won, but then they lost on appeal. This particular branch of the church, they reject the role of prophet president, even though Hedrick was originally ordained that way. After him, they're like, yeah, no, we don't do that anymore. They're governed by apostles. They reject baptism for the dead and celestial marriage. So they've got some doctrinal nuances different from a lot of the other branches. They've got about 7,000 members at present, mostly in the United States. Then we've got the Remnant Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So this is Frederick Niels Larson. He's the great-grandson of Joseph Smith, Jr. And after these schisms that I talked about in the reorganized church, there were all these breakaways, and now they're back to these unaffiliated, disconnected, disorganized branches, independent RLDS type Mormons. And so this guy, Larson, the great-grandson, he meets with some of these other branches in May of 1999. They decide to form up their own little more organized church, and so they create the Remnant Church in April 6th, again, the year 2000. April 6, 2000 is when you get this Remnant Church coming onto the scene. Larson was chosen to become the president of the high priesthood for the Remnant Church, and he was sustained as the prophet and president of the church until his death in 2019. They have their headquarters near the temple lot across from the Independence Temple, which is the headquarters of the Community of Christ. So you got all these little branches. You got the Temple Lot Church, and you got the now the Community of Christ. You've got the Remnant Church. All these guys are nearby. And what's I find interesting is that this Remnant Church was created in part for reasons of objection to losing the lineal succession, right? Appointing this guy who was not from Joseph's lineage to become president of the reorganized church. So this guy, Larson, who is Joseph Smith's great-grandson, becomes president. And then their second president, because this guy just died a few years ago, 2019, their second and current president is Terry Patience, is his name. And I can't find any evidence that he's a descendant of Joseph. The bios for like Larson and all these other guys tout their connection to Joseph, right? Oh, I'm Joseph's great-grandson, blah, 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 right? Like that's the point of like pride and, hey, you know. However, for this guy, Terry Patience, his bio on their own website says nothing about it. I couldn't find any evidence online. So it appears that he is not a descendant of Joseph Smith, which makes it kind of ironic or weird that this branch, the Remnant Church, broke off of RLDS. Again, there were other reasons, women in the priesthood and so forth, I'm sure, that were part of this, but part of it was lineal succession, and they've gone back on that. And then you've got, a lot of what are called restoration branches or remnant branches. So again, these like disorganized branches that broke off of the RLDS church in the mid-'80s. They consider the Community of Christ, as they're now known, to become corrupt and fallen into apostasy, so that the church is now in an unorganized state, which is, from their perspective, what happened after Joseph's death from 1844 until the church was organized in 1860. So a lot of these branches, not all of them, but a lot of the branches have organized themselves into what they call the Joint Conference of Restoration Branches. And as of 2010, that conference of restoration branches reported having between like 6,000 to 7,000 members. Keep in mind, this is not all the branches that broke off of the RLDS church. Some of those branches became the Remnant Church, which is more organized. So there's other disconnected restoration branches. In fact, one thing I read said that the majority of restoration branches do not participate in this joint conference. So back to the breakoffs in the 80s and around then, tens of thousands, some 25,000 plus people broke off. Now all those people have had kids, and those numbers presumably have grown. So potentially there's many, many thousands of people in these kind of disorganized branches. The Joint Conference of Restoration Branches did organize new apostles. At the 2008 National Conference that they held, several officials were ordained to the office of 70. And these were the first new ordinations to that office recognized by any of the restoration branches over 20 years. There's though still debate within these branches as to whether those ordinations are even legitimate. So, because it's not a church, it's like the Conference of Independent Branches, and who has authority, and how's this working? And so there's a lot of like debate and disagreement. Now, that image I showed at the beginning showing all the breakoffs, I mentioned that it doesn't include, oddly enough, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The history on this one is fairly straightforward. Most people are familiar with it. After Woodruff received or issued the manifesto in 1890, kind of disavowing polygamy and saying, hey, God told me if we don't stop this, then, all our assets are going to be taken and the church will be, destroyed type of thing. There were many people who ignored that manifesto, many polygamous people. in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that ignored that manifesto. And so in 1904, a decade and a half later, Joseph F. Smith, who's now president, issues what is called the Second Manifesto. And the church began excommunicating people who would continue to enter new plural marriages. Right? There was this like, okay, fine, all these other families can be grandfathered in, but we're going to stop doing new marriages. And some people were doing this in secret and private and whatnot. And so Joseph F. Smith comes in to, tighten the screws and say, we're not doing this. We're going to start excommunicating people to show that we really mean it. Because the 1890 manifesto is like, oh, hey, publicly we're saying we're not doing this, but internally, like, nothing much is going to change. Well, 1904 comes around and they're serious now because, they want to please the feds and not cause more problems. So a lot of polygamists are exiled and start gathering in Short Creek, and gathering there, feeling like, the church has become corrupt, that this is invalid. We need to maintain this true doctrine and eternal principle. So they start gathering in Short Creek, and so lots of them get excommunicated. Some of the locally prominent men in Short Creek, so this is Lauren Woolley and John Barlow, they create an organization called the Council of Friends. And this is basically 7 high priests who claim the authority to continue plural marriage. So kind of their governing council, the Council of Friends. 1935, the church, LDS Church, excommunicated the Mormon residents of Short Creek who refused to sign an oath renouncing polygamy. So even, this is 3 decades later, they're still pursuing people. They're still trying to root this out and excommunicate people who are doing this. Of course, then there's the famous raids of Short Creek, 1945, 1953, when law enforcement goes in to break up families, lock up the polygamous men, take people's fathers and grandfathers and haul them off to jail. And it's during this time that this group, there's a bunch of breakoffs. So, you've got this now fundamentalist church that claims the authority from the Council of Friends, and they started to grow it. And you've got Rulon Jeffs, and then now, more recently, Warren Jeffs. But there's this breakoff in the 50s leading to the Apostolic United Brethren, the Kingstons, the Centennial Park group, the Righteous branch of the church, which is the Peterson group, and a lot of independent polygamists who, kind of like the RLDS independent ones and so forth, believe the doctrine, share the same kind of like root, foundational, doctrinal connection and ideas, but are just totally independent. So you've got a lot of these groups, the FLDS, the Apostolic United Brethren, the Kingston Centennial Group, Peterson Group, all these others, big branches breaking off of the FLDS Church over disagreements. But all of them share the belief that polygamy is this pure eternal principle, but there's these schisms causing people to go different ways, and then a lot of people to just independently do their own thing, read the Book of Mormon at home with their family and still believe these things, but not recognize the authority of any of these groups. Of course, even before Joseph died, like I started this musing talking about the succession crisis, right? And that kind of prompting a whole bunch of breakoffs. But even before Joseph was murdered, there were a whole bunch of breakoffs. As you might imagine, people who disagree with him over various things and said, oh, he's a fallen prophet, I'm going to go start my own thing. There was the Pure Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints by Wickham Clark, or the Independent Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Ezra Booth started his Church of Christ. Warren Parrish started his Church of Christ. Hiram Page, one of the 8 witnesses, started his Church of Christ. You've got the Alston Church, which is Isaac Russell. You've got George Hinkle starting the Church of Jesus Christ, the Bride, the Lamb's Wife. And then right before his death, you've got William Law and his cohorts who start the Nauvoo Expositor together, starting the true Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, feeling like Joseph has fallen. So even during his lifetime, but certainly since, there have been all these breakoffs from disagreements over doctrine, over policy changes, and so forth. Well, what about breakaways from the modern Brighamite Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? Perhaps most notably, and anything that's been lasting, is the results of Denver Snuffer, who is a lawyer and an author. He was excommunicated from the church in 2013, and I've owned some of his books for, I don't know, a decade and a half probably, and I've read a total of like 4 pages in them. I just never cracked them open, but they're sitting on my bookshelf. So he gets excommunicated. He's writing stuff about the second, the Comforter, and getting it like he claims that Jesus visited him, and he starts to get into these things that make his local leaders uncomfortable, and potentially leaders up at Salt Lake who push for this potentially. And so in 2013, he's excommunicated. Well, the next year, Denver Snuffer says he receives a revelation informing him that the Lord terminated the priesthood authority of the LDS church leadership that were involved in his excommunication. So he goes off and starts his own thing, starts holding conferences in 2016. Thousands of people, around 5,000 people I read online, showing up at these conferences. They see Snuffer as kind of a modern James Strang or whatever, right? And giving new scripture. So they canonize some of Snuffer's teachings. So sometimes these people are called the Snufferites, or Doctrine of Christ is how a lot of them are known. And this particular group, of which there are now thousands apparently, they hold that, like the RLDS type people, that Brigham was an apostasy. Most of the Snufferites believe that Joseph Smith did not practice polygamy, and so they're kind of in this independent break-off from the church mode, where they kind of see Snuffer as this sort of prophet, but a lot of these people just feel very independent about their approach to the gospel, and are kind of anti-establishment and the corruption of the centralization of tithing and financial resources, and they're kind of more distributed and decentralized now under this group. And so beyond the Snufferites, there are a lot of, again, like the RLDS and the FLDS, there's a lot of mainline Brighamite LDS type folks who are independent, who did not join the Snufferites, no longer go to the church. So the church members would see them as inactive, but these people see themselves as faithful to the gospel. They still believe the gospel, but they just have some disagreements with the LDS church, with its direction, with its policy changes, with there may be there are a lot of sympathies with this remnant movement, the Snufferite type of movement, but they just don't affiliate with those people. So I know a lot of people who fall into this camp who are might be considered functionally inactive in terms of church participation with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but these people I know who would fall into this category are deeply committed to the restored gospel. They just have they kind of put some distance between themselves and the church. So even in modern times, there have been disagreements, just like when the reorganized church gave women the priesthood and changed lineal succession. Whenever you have these, or when the Brighamite church abandoned polygamy, then that prompted the FLDS. Whenever you have these big doctrinal changes and pivots being made, there are those who question, just like during Joseph's time when he would reveal new doctrine. William Law, right? Like, oh no, you're a fallen prophet now, so now I got to go start my own thing. So I don't think this is going to go away. I think we're going to see more breakoffs, because if history is any indication of the future, then certainly as more changes happen, including if maybe they're not totally inspired or whatever, you might see more people breaking off, whether in a formal sense to form some of their organization and church of their own, or just kind of remaining believing in the ideas and the doctrines, but not agreeing with the new direction and wanting to distance themselves. Now, it would appear that I, as faithful listeners of my musings will know, share some perspectives with the modern breakoffs, the Snufferites of the world, the Doctrine of Christ people. I've had people accuse me or suggest online that, he's part of this group or whatever. The reality for me, because I don't believe that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy and had sex with multiple women, and and I've done a whole musing on that. You go listen to, right? And I don't think the evidence is there to support that, and that's what many of these people believe. I do have a lot of concerns with, as I've shared openly in my musings, with past decisions of church leaders, and so some have suspected that I harbor these types of sentiments and beliefs, and therefore I'm in this group. The reality is, as I said, I've read maybe a tiny handful of pages of Snuffer's books. I haven't been to these guys' websites or conferences, and I know nothing really about them other than just at a surface level what their claims are and their positions are. Part of that is I've not wanted to affiliate or really look into them that much, because I prefer to kind of forge my own path and study things out. And if there are some overlaps of concerns or beliefs, then fine. But, I don't want to just jump into a new camp and like the, John Page, the apostle, he's like, oh, James Strang, oh, Williams. I don't want to bounce around, all over. I want to be very kind of deliberate and studious and really try and contemplate what is true, what is right, what feels good, what can I be inspired, what steps can I, take in which direction. So I've kind of kept myself aloof from these people, even though I know they're over there. We probably share some perspectives and beliefs. I probably disagree with them on a bunch of other stuff. Now, I say all that to say this. I am planning, I don't know how soon, hopefully in the, next few months, but I am planning to do a 2-part series here on my podcast where I dig into Brother Brigham and some of the doctrinal concerns at the root of his leadership, founding this Brighamite branch of the church, but then also, more importantly, why I stay a member of this Brighamite branch of the church. Because I've gotten that question, hey, if you've got these concerns, if you think that Brigham Young, wrongly created polygamy and, whatever, why are you still a member of, the Brighamite branch of the church? It's a fair question. And I've got answers, some of which you probably heard before, at least one of which I'm certain that you haven't considered before. But for this 2-part series, I want to dig in a little bit into what Brigham did during his time in leadership. And then in part 2, I want to talk about why I don't share the same opinion of the Doctrine of Christ people and the Snufferites and others who see that, Brigham Young was this, corrupt source of the fountain, and so everything downstream of that is contaminated, and the modern church is not, true and on a good course. They've apostatized, they've lost the priesthood, on and on and on. These are the arguments that these people make. So I'll share in part 2 of this upcoming musing why I disagree with that perspective, why, despite my concerns with Brigham, as I will reveal in part 1, why I choose to stay and why I believe that you and everyone else ought to stay as part of this branch. Again, as we've reviewed, there have been many branches. Most of them have fizzled out. Some of them, are still somewhat strong, like Community of Christ and so forth, but certainly paling in comparison to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Brighamite branch and the growth that has been seen there. So stay tuned for future musing where we will get into that. I have not covered all of the different branches. That would be a very long musing. Again, you can see in that graphic that I shared how many there have been. These are some of the main highlights, just to reinforce the point that this is a pattern we've seen in the past, and no doubt it will be a pattern we see in the future. That as major changes are made, there will be people who disagree, who break off. It's happening now. It will happen in the future. And so, the typical reaction of people when they hear that is like, oh, follow the brethren, follow the 12, follow the keys. And there's probably sound counsel in that. I'm going to unpack that a little bit in that future musing. But I think it's more than just following people. It's understanding the doctrine. It's understanding, what's subject to change and whether God is a changing God, and some of these, huge things are truly changing in a valid way and so forth. Kind of using not only our hearts and seeking the Spirit, but using our brains as well and trying to take a semi-rational approach to this and assess it dispassionately to understand what's right, what's true, and what's good for me to do. So stay tuned for that future musing. Hopefully this was insightful, if nothing else, from a historical curiosity perspective to better understand the the many different branches and our Mormon cousins across different branches. Some of these, the Whiteites and others, I'm sure you hadn't heard about. A lot of these people share the same foundational beliefs, and so we have a lot in common with them. And to know that they don't even exist, I think, is a problem. So you've been informed. There's lots of great stuff online. Go look at these churches' websites and kind of dig into their perspective. It's kind of interesting just to see their different approach to how they practice and worship today, despite having this kind of core foundational set of beliefs in common with us. So it's worth spending some time poking around, learning more about them. Hopefully this has been insightful and interesting to you, and I'll see you next Sunday.